and thank you for joining us for episode 6 of our Overshadowed series, discussing how modern IT and security teams are dealing with the risks of shadow IT. I'm Russ Spitler, CEO and co-founder of Nudge Security, and with me today is Ira Winkler, CISO of CYE Security, and author of You Can Stop Stupid, Advanced Persistent Security and Security Awareness for Dummies, and 5 other books. Welcome, Ira. Really great to talk to you today.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
So today we'll be talking about how to design a security program that engages employees positively in the process of mitigating risk, a topic that has been one of the founding principles of Nudge Security and obviously one that you've had extensive research in. Can you give us a little bit of history about kind of what work you've done and then how long you've been working in this area?
Yeah, I'm going to be dating myself, but way back, I can't remember the year, but way back when one day I was working for a government contractor, defense contractor, and they said, instead of going to the Pentagon, can you make a few phone calls? Anyway, 3 days later, I had control over one of the world's largest investment banks doing what was essentially social engineering. And I didn't even know what the term social engineering was at the time. They just basically asked me to call up and lie to people and try to get access to computer systems. So, that was just like growing up in New York. That's how you survive, pretty much. So anyway, did that. Then I wrote a paper about that, and he called it the seminal work in social engineering. And I had to look up again what seminal meant, what social engineering meant. And I ended up, people just started coming to me to do more and more of these, social engineering things. I call them espionage simulations, because I'd combine it with not just calling people up, but doing on-site work, black bag operations. I brought in special forces and intelligence operatives to help me with this. So I did a bunch of espionage simulations, essentially. And, the companies would have me do that, and then they'd have me come back and give people presentations on how I essentially screwed them over. And people loved it and stuff. And the great irony was it was so ineffective. I mean, it's like, but I would keep getting all this work. Like, I see people how to rob banks and everything, and it's just so unproductive at the end of the day. And I'll talk about that probably later. But, anyway, so I would do this stuff. I'd start creating awareness programs and things like that. I started a company, Securementum, which focused on the human aspects of cybersecurity. And then over time, essentially going into what you're talking about, awareness is important, but telling funny stories, you got to consider in, what's known as the forgetting curve. And the forgetting curve basically says that when you tell somebody something, it go ahead and over time, it decreases. I think the statistic is something like they'll forget 70% of what you say the first day. And then by the time you get to the end of 30 days, they forget pretty much 90% if they remember anything by that point in time. So when you start looking at that, I realized that all these awareness programs I was creating over decades, I started to work to change that over, as time progressed. But when you're talking about what really makes for an effective security awareness program, it's not just feeding people information. Just giving people random information isn't going to work. Giving people, for example, a lot of people say you need funny videos and stuff like that. Funny, in some cases, trivializes things. Like, you never see a funny awareness video for sexual harassment, for example.
Right.
And at the same time, you could trivialize it, but at the end of the day, what does it actually do in practice at best? At best, it extends the forgetting curve a little bit more.
Right.
And so what you want to do is you want to figure out what can you do, not just with awareness, and I use my Dr. Evil quotes to say awareness, but what can you do to modify and improve behaviors throughout the course of your entire security program? And that's where I began to realize, again, you mentioned my book, You Can Stop Stupid, where I essentially lay out a practice that I call human security engineering, where what you're doing is you're embedding proper security before it gets to the user, trying to lead the user into better behaviors. And once you have the user into better behaviors, you can then go ahead and guide them, but simultaneously expect it. Like I keep telling a story. Sorry, I'm way off. I don't know what your question was anymore, but
I'm
but
not
I
going to stop you.
I tell the story how I was at an event once and they were giving away stickers that essentially said, "Don't click on SH*T." So sorry,
Right.
try not to curse for you guys. But anyway, it basically said, don't click on, I'll use the word stuff. Don't click on stuff. And this guy in front of me was an admin type, and he's like, "I need a whole bunch of these stickers." I'm like, "Really?" And he's like, "Yeah, my users keep clicking on all this stuff." I'm like, "Wow, you must be giving your users lots of stuff to click on." And then he's like, "What do you mean?" I'm like, "Well, if they're clicking on stuff, how are they getting it? You must be giving it to them." And then he's like, "Well, I don't know," and then he's mumbling. And then I go, "And by the way, if you're going to give them all this stuff and they're going to click on it, why aren't you doing anything to stop the impact of them clicking on it?"
Right.
And so you got to look at everything as a system. The problem is when people talk about awareness, they talk about awareness, but awareness is a tactic. And frankly, even though I wrote Security Awareness for Dummies, I still think security awareness is a tactic that might be the least efficient tactic in many ways. Like, for example, a secure email gateway is going to filter out 99.99% of actual malicious attacks. Security awareness, don't get me wrong, is still critical because you still need to go ahead and at the point or at the proximity of where an attack can be realized, you want to go ahead and say, "Hey, how can I reduce the likelihood that the proximity will activate the attack?"
Right.
And it's not just, and unfortunately, we keep too much focus on phishing. It's not just on phishing. It's, for example, lost computer devices, giving away passwords, allowing shoulder surfing, leaving your facilities unattended facilities, leaving vulnerable information vulnerable, and so on. But you have to go ahead and have awareness to make sure. But at the same time, you also want to go ahead and put some technical controls in place as well. So, for example, yes, people can leave their computers unlocked and unattended, but that's why we have computer monitors or screensavers that time out, as an example. It's why, for example, you might have a turnstile at an entrance instead of just a swipe with a mechanical
Right.
door
The
that
door.
opens up for
Yeah.
people so anybody could go in when one person swipes it, and so on. So anyway, not remembering what your question was, I'll leave it
Well,
there and go.
yeah. So, I mean, what I love about that is you just brought up so many great examples of security controls that actually embrace the realities of human behavior. Right.
Mhm.
Whereas when we often think about cybersecurity, a lot of the things that we've done in the past is create these controls where we treat humans like an extension of the computer. If I just stop them from doing something, we're going to be fine now. But the reality, as you said, is they're going to still click on the links. What can we do to actually stop the impact of that click? Or they're still going to sign up for the SaaS service or click an OAuth grant or whatever it's going to be.
Yeah.
How do we actually start to mitigate the impact instead of trying to prevent the action?
Yeah, and that's fundamentally where, we seem to be losing it. Again, we are addressing the problem with tactics and not strategies because it's a tactic to implement awareness. Now, there might be a strategy, but in the overall, of awareness, but overall, awareness is a tactic. A secure email gateway, very good tool. It's a tactic. And we need these tactics, but we need them to be harmonized across a strategy. And that's where the industry is failing itself. I mean, even when I see still consider most of them awareness vendors, even when I see awareness vendors saying we're now a behavioral modification company, I'm like, "Oh, how are you doing that?" They're like pushing out videos in different ways and keeping different metrics. It's
Yeah.
okay. It's, you
It's
know,
I always think about when I was learning to drive a car, right? Like I didn't learn about a three-point turn reading it in a book. I didn't learn about it doing it by myself 50 times. I had somebody sitting next to me helping me through the first 10 times I did it. And that behavioral modification was incredibly beneficial having that advisor and that expert. when you kind of think about how we bring that into kind of human-centric programs and engagements, how do you sort of get an assessment of how we can do a better job of
Mhm.
providing that in context, awareness, or in context sort of modifications, and how do you think that might map to kind of the broader cybersecurity programs that people are putting in place?
So that's essentially what I mean. Well, the name of your company, Nudge, kind of go is like screaming. That's a leading question, I'm pretty sure. But I think, nudges are essentially awareness lessons delivered at the point in time where they're most valuable. And so, for example, like the iconic one that most of us are familiar with, I want to look at my cell phone because there's actually a picture. I took a picture the last week of the most, yeah, sorry, I don't know if you're going to be able to see this, but so anyway, I don't know if can you see that?
There we go. Uh, wash their hands, right?
Well, it says,
Of,
of
of
course,
course.
our employees
Oh,
want.
sure. Yeah.
It says, "Of course, our employees wash their hands." And
Yeah.
the reason I took this picture was there's the iconic one that we're all familiar with, which
Yeah.
was, okay, employees must wash hands before returning to work.
Right.
That's the most common nudge I see in the real world, where they are telling employees, yes, before you leave the restroom, you must wash your hands, period.
Totally.
And so, but this one, I just like the wording, like, well, it has the same impact, but it's phrased like, okay, we don't hire morons. But it still gets the message across that if you're an employee, you got to wash
Yeah.
your hands.
Yeah. Don't be the moron employee. Right.
Yeah. So I like that because it's more delivered in a way that doesn't scare, the potential customers as opposed to like getting while giving the message to the employees type of thing. So
Totally.
that's a better way, but that's an example. Having things like interactions. Like there was a long time ago, I was working with one of the anti-malware vendors. This was more than a decade ago now, where we were trying to go ahead and when, for example, DLP would block something, they wanted to go ahead and we were experimenting with putting awareness messages in response to that. Like, okay, you're sending out a message that contains PII.
Yeah.
We're going to, well, and DLP should stop that. But not only should it stop it, it can use a messaging at the same time that says, wait a second, this message contains sensitive information. You don't just randomly stop them, you provide them information at the right point in time. So that was an example of a technical control combined with a nudge at the same time. And, nudges can be coffee cups, like, that people put on their desk. It could be those mouse pads, could be a screensaver, could be like stickers on laptops that remind people, do not leave this laptop unattended, things like that. Those are example of nudges.
I think that DLP example is such a great one because that's one of the areas where I sort of, well, DLP has a long and sordid history in terms of accuracy and effectiveness. But like when I've been in those environments, there's been times when I've tried to send documents for legitimate business purposes with legitimate data sets in
Mhm.
that sort of more defensive control where they might block it or filter it has caused me to go, okay, well, I'll throw it in Dropbox, I'll get around the DLP or whatever it might be, right? As
Right.
opposed to potentially a more effective nudge, which would have been, hey, are you sure this sender is appropriate? Like, this is the type of content we found. Did you know this content was in there? Click a button to proceed. And that's exactly where I see the opportunity for us to evolve in terms of security controls and programs, where we actually do give a lot more autonomy to those employees, but a lot more context for what the impact of their decision is to
Mhm.
ensure that it's appropriate. Now, there's always limits to that, but I see that as a future that we strive for.
Yep. So,
So when just a couple of other questions. So when you're thinking about kind of designing and rolling out new security controls, obviously we've been talking about sort of some of the awareness aspects. But when we think about sort of more traditional controls like an EDR agent or something along those lines, How can we start to engage leaders? How can security leaders engage employees positively in that process to drive better outcomes? Is that something you've taken a look at before?
Yeah, I mean, that's always been critical. I mean, how you deliver, see, there's always this thing where, so, sorry, switching to a topic that seems completely irrelevant. But there was one time where, you know, I, I have a lot of friends who are CISOs. I have a friend who at the time was a CISO of a Fortune 30 company. And he goes, Ira, I have a question for you. He's like, I was just in a meeting, like the executive meeting with my CEO and all the other C-level people. And during the meeting, the CEO said that we are moving to a BYOD device policy. And he's like, well, that's just impossible to control, blah, 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 and all that sort of stuff. And anyway, the CEO basically said, okay, as everybody was leaving, he pulled the CISO aside and said, okay, here's the thing. In 2 weeks, you're going to tell me, how am I going to implement BYOD securely? Or in 3 weeks, I'm going to have a new CISO. So the question then became, I have this thing, and just about in every book I write, it's called the Department of How. And cybersecurity should be considering, how do you do things, not just you can't do something.
Absolutely.
In general, I shouldn't say always. There's you don't want cybersecurity to be the Department of No. It should be, okay, how do you do it, and how do you embed it within practice? Because too many times we look at security as something that's bolted on to everything else, as opposed to building cybersecurity practices into other systems, other processes, and things like that. So, for example, if you're going to go ahead, here's a great example that I see a lot. What do you call it? Accounts payable fraud is a big problem for a lot of companies. And so there was one company I was working with. It was a private company, so it can't be like a Fortune 500, but it was a $60 billion private company. And they had a lot of issues regarding where criminals would try to send these account changes into the accounts payable people. So, for example, they say, oh, we just changed our bank account. Please now route our funding to this new account as opposed to the old account. And so it was like, oh my God, the first time, obviously they fell for it a couple times, but then the question became, how can we go ahead and implement this securely? How can we go ahead and take the process and have a verification of account changes? And so there were some account changes where, we put in manual processes that included, you're not allowed to accept, a change of, bank account unless you go through the following checks and verifications. So it wasn't just, an email came in or something was faxed in. You had to go through, somebody had to pick it up. And to change it, it's like, okay, you needed to have 2 sign-offs that the account was changed by the POC and then on the POC's letterhead. So they then, in theory, had to not just send an email in, they had to go ahead and know who the POC was, on top of knowing everything else about the company and so on, which I'm not going to say they never experienced it again, but it made it exponentially more difficult because there's no such thing as perfect security.
Yeah.
But you can go ahead and enhance your processes to account for different things. But the key is, it's not something you bolted on. It's something that was just accepted as a process within the process of changing account information.
I think that's such a great example because I often find myself in this conversation of sort of risk tolerance versus friction for the employees.
Mm-hmm.
And the reality is, it doesn't need to be a trade-off between those two attributes. There's another piece, as you sort of mentioned there, which is we can, introduce new processes which don't necessarily introduce friction, but reduce our risk substantially as well. And that's I think an area where we have a huge opportunity for improvement as we go forward.
Yep.
Well, Ira, really enjoyed talking with you. We could go on for hours about this topic, but it's time for us to wrap up today. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Thank you, Ira, for being our guest today. It's been a pleasure to talk to you, and stay tuned for future episodes of Overshadowed. Hope you can join us again soon.
Thank you.